Mhm. Just waiting for YouTube to wake up. Okay. All right, so we can get started. Thank you everyone for being here for this popular culture dialogue. It's kind of a follow-up to one that we had several months ago. I don't remember the exact number of months, but it's about cancel culture again. And back in the previous one, we talked more about what is cancel culture and how to define it and how it's being used and so on and so forth. And we didn't really get to the consequences part of it. So here we're going to talk more about the consequences. And consequences not just for popular culture, but for maybe, politics, economics, society, culture, human life, I guess. We can really go broad there. But as always, we're going to ask each person to introduce themselves. And maybe as part of the introduction, then, what brings you here today, give us what your definition of cancel culture is, so we can start with that baseline right away. So I believe we've got everyone here, so we will start then with Colette.
Hi, I'm Colette Balmain. I teach media communication at Kingston University. I run a course on freedom, censorship and subversion, a MA course. So one of the things we deal with is, can you separate the art from the artist? And that relates to cancel culture. I think it's a really difficult one because I'm aware of people like Kathleen Stock talking about being cancelled and yet being in the paper and on TV all the time. So I think that I'm not so sure it's really a thing. I think culturally it's different. So in South Korea, if you're an idol and if you break the law, or if it's found out you bullied someone when you were in school, you will immediately have to leave the industry. Mm. So in South Korea, that there really is cancel culture. And a lot of the time, unfortunately, fans are behind the particular idol getting cancelled.
Interesting. That might be something to think about when we talk more about consequences then too. Good. All right, go over then to Mars.
Hi, I'm Mars Bronzer here. I'm a PhD student at Sheffield Hallam University in the United Kingdom. And I guess my definition, I do take an issue with the expression of cancel culture itself. I think it's just a bit of a politicized buzzword that's been essentially not necessarily invented, but very much co-opted by right-wing propaganda, at least. I'm not aware of other social contexts, but definitely in the West. So I think ultimately when we talk about cancel culture meaningfully, we're talking about, to me, a collective decision to stop supporting someone based on something, usually celebrities. And I think that also opens up the discussion on who is a celebrity. And there's, I think, a lot there to unpack. It's maybe an umbrella term that covers a lot of different things that shouldn't be lumped together as much.
Yeah, that's probably a very important thing that we'll have to try to pull apart more, because the way that you define it most likely is going to be related to the consequences for it. Okay, great. And then we'll go down to Princess.
Hi, I'm Princess Nicolí, and I'm from St. Lucia. And I believe there's no such thing as cancel culture, at least in the West. I think that, like Mars says, a lot of it is propaganda by the right-wing media and people who don't want to, by people who don't want to accept that they spot out racist and homophobic and classist things. That's what I think it's about.
Great. We're going to have some wonderful perspectives on this then too. And I like that we're going to be taking a global look at it as well. Thank you, Princess. Going over then to Alon or Alan.
Hi, I'm Alon. Surprisingly, I'm also from in Sheffield in the UK. That's a pretty nice coincidence. I'm a researcher and youth scientist, but I also do LGBTQ activism and an educator. I think that everything that's been said previous is absolutely correct. There's a version of cancel culture that's just right-wing propaganda. There's a version of cancel culture which is almost boring, when people who are definitely in the mainstream are just like complaining about being canceled. But I think there's also cancel culture, which is a dynamic of exclusion between someone that people perceive to be powerful, whether it's true or not, and a group of people who look up to this person, who just decided to exclude this person and kind of given up on that person. And that's the part of cancel culture I do find to be interesting and not just like hair-tearingly annoying to hear about.
It's kind of why we want to talk about it with popular culture, because that brings kind of the popular and the public and the masses and the fandom, as Colette brought in, brings in those dynamics. Okay, great. Thank you. And then we're going to go over to Christina.
Hey, hi. I'm a PhD student from Germany, University of Tübingen, and my PhD focuses on ideological negotiations and fan conflicts. So, of course, the term cancel comes up quite a lot in those fan discourses I look at. And for example, if I look at Raylo shippers, the question is, can a ship or a shipper be cancelled? How would we describe this behavior? Is this different from mainstream celebrities being described as cancelled? And how I would informally define the term is a mixture of boycotting and harassment. So that it's not just a silent boycott, but actively trying to work against those who support it. And I also, besides doing my PhD, work in teacher education. So one thing that I always also find interesting about this topic is, what do teachers or future teachers need to know about what goes on in media fandom to prepare them for teaching young people nowadays?
And just, I think, teaching anyone these days, I don't know if you've all heard, but there was an incident at the University of Waterloo where a professor teaching gender studies was attacked by someone who just came into the classroom. And that type of violent cancel is perhaps the worst form that cancel culture could take. But it is definitely something that anyone who's in the public needs to be aware of, that this type of thing is out there. Great. And certainly not, but last but not least, we have Becca.
Hi, everyone. My name is Becca Sanaikia. I am a PhD student at University of Rochester. I am in Rochester, New York. And I'm also a trans activist, so it's also important. This topic is important for me personally. I think we should make a distinction between the cancellation as an strategy and what the right wing sculpted, as Mar said, the idea of maybe boycotting someone who is mostly celebrity, probably in media. But the strategy of canceling is the last resort of underprivileged or minorities who don't have power and who are trying their best to fight against some some harms that they were against.
So I think you bring up an interesting dynamic that we have, not just this idea of maybe cancel in terms of, sure, Christina, not just cancel in terms of fandom or politics, but there's also, there's these very deep relationships with power and the disenfranchised, the disempowered within a society or culture, how this might be something that is a tool that they would have to use in order to even just be heard about the complaints that they have. So even with this discussion then about the different types of cancel culture, we see a lot of different ways we can start getting into consequences, because now we have consequences in terms of politics, in terms of fandom practices, in terms of fandom business, I guess, that relationship as well. But then also in terms of the cultural and social issues, along with the political issues that come up. So I'm kind of thinking of where we want to start, but maybe because this is a popular culture dialogue, we'll start with popular culture. So given how you see cancel culture, the extent to which it exists, the way that it exists, how it operates, what do you see as an impact that even the idea of cancel culture has had, or specific instances of cancel culture have had on popular culture at this point in time? What is the impact of popular culture from cancel culture in any shape or form that it takes?
I think that the impact of cancel culture has a twofold consequence. On one hand, you see certain popular culture industry companies take action, and if somebody says something racist, they take action, and even though people accuse them of canceling, they still take action and get this person out. And then you see on the other side, people complain, oh, this person said that this thing 10, 20 years ago, they shouldn't be canceled. So it's a two-way fold impact on popular culture.
And I think DC and Warner Brothers has demonstrated some interesting examples of that recently, between picking up James Gunn after Disney kind of canceled him for a little bit, but then keeping Ezra Miller in, even though all of the allegations against him and The Flash might have been, I've heard that The Flash wasn't good for a lot of different reasons, but the fact that he was still involved with it may not have helped either as well.
Sorry, just wanted to know that Ezra Miller does use they, them pronouns.
Oh, yes, thank you. Yeah, and it'll be interesting when thinking about this too. Disney, with the allegations now against Jonathan, I want to say Major, but it might be Mayer, I can't remember now, from Ant-Man. Yeah, and who's the other one? Oh, the person who plays Namor has some allegations against them now too. So it'll be interesting to see how Disney handles that going forward. But this is one way that we have seen popular culture being impacted. What are some other ways that we've seen?
I think that one thing to kind of think about cancel culture in like a capitalist context is that a lot of the time, we, the fans, kind of take everything very personally, but from the company's point of view, it's mostly a money decision, right? Why James Gunn yes, and Ezra Miller yes, but not someone else? A lot of the time, it's just like the calculation of what's going to cost them, right? I do think that one thing that kind of seeps down to culture from like the idea of cancel culture is artists kind of trying to think ahead. And that kind of both restricts people. So I'm a fan of stand-up, and I know that in stand-up, a lot of people are now kind of self-restricting, but also that creates a space for creativity and kind of learning how to do things differently a little bit.
Yeah.
So this kind of like thinking ahead and kind of thinking about what the people want within this context is also something that might be a consequence.
Yeah. Mars?
Yeah, I just want to jump about, in a way, also related to stand-up. Something I immediately thought about was the recent John Mulaney comeback, and how sometimes this impact of like canceling is for very different reasons from very different online bubbles. So to me, a person struggling with addiction and going through a divorce isn't anything cancelable, right? And I thought the reason why the general sentiment towards John Mulaney had gone negative was his platforming of Dave Chappelle after the transphobic comments. Then watching the special, there is actually zero mention of that platforming or any kind of reference to transphobia. And when he acknowledges that he's problematic now, it's all about his struggle with with his divorce and his addiction, which to me felt very alienating. I was like, why are we not talking about this other thing that to me is actually harmful? And I've noticed in general, there is this bubble amongst the people who are doing the counseling, who are concerned about something that isn't actually necessarily the harmful thing. And I'm thinking also recently about the Idol, the TV show, which I haven't seen. It doesn't look like my thing, but a lot of people seemed very concerned with the artistic content of the show and censoring the more explicit or like dark themes of the show. And to me, that's not something that we should be censoring. If it's like, that's not canceling in a like positive way of speaking truth to power. And like, especially when it comes to, I don't know, like the conversation about Sam Levinson as well. A lot of people are concerned about the content of his media rather than the treatment of people on set. I think there is a bit of a difference, like, what's the word? Like a divide between actual consequences and actual issues, and then a moral panic that is linked to this canceling in a different way.
That's an interesting point just to bring up quick, because if you think about it in terms of a moral panic, this idea of cancel culture perhaps has a much longer history, because you can go back to D&D, the Beatles, Elvis Presley, and forward. It's almost like when, like you said, when people are existing in a specific community with specific morals or ideologies and they become uncomfortable, then they might seek to get rid of it, which then extends this idea to the legislation against drag right now in the United States, which kind of gets to Becca's point about the underrepresented and the disenfranchised. Those are definitely popular culture examples as well.
They are, and I think that, and I agree with the whole business around the Idol, because there's nothing really in it that we don't see elsewhere. You know, it's not as if it's doing anything particularly different, but it's kind of responsive to the backlash. And yet I think the issue is that a lot of the backlash, and this always comes with media panics, is from people that haven't watched it, that are making judgments based on what other people are saying about it. And I wonder, I wonder with the Idol, whether it's also tied up in questions of racial politics, and, you know, whether that's got something to do with what we're seeing, because we see worse content. Game of Thrones, much worse content. You know, we see kind of rape being, I don't know, popularized, like this theme, and nobody really does anything about it. So, I mean, I'm not sure with the Idol, they're saying that there were meant to be 6 episodes, but there are only 5 episodes now, and that it's been pulled early. So I think the thing around the Idol represents the negative aspects of cancel culture, because it's not that the artist is R. Kelly, who's doing something terrible. The artist hasn't done anything terrible, and you're just cancelling it because you don't like the content. And so it seems to me that is perhaps a more problematic side of cancel culture that everybody's kind of talking about. It's because a group of people don't like something and are loud enough about not liking it, then we have a disproportionate response to this. And I do, and I think of the TV series that I've watched, which have been just terrible, and which have got second seasons. And I think the problem with TV and film and music these days is that you have to have fans. And if your fans turn against you, or if your audience turns against you, you have no hope at all of having a second season or sequel, unless you're part of like the Marvel universe and you can kind of like rework things. And people are so invested in Marvel that that's never going to die. But I think it's really problematic.
I like that distinction too about the canceling of the content versus the canceling of the creator. And that might be another way to think about the consequences as well. And then, of course, there's the reactions maybe of the fans. I know sometimes I've had problems engaging with something because of how I've seen the fans acting towards it. And I am a huge Star Wars fan, but it can be hard sometimes to engage with more recent stuff because of the fans. So I don't know, Christina, if you have any, or Becca, any thoughts that you'd like to add at this point about consequences in popular culture?
I just want to add to what you were talking about. I want to mention Natalie Wine also talks about canceling in one of her YouTube videos. There is a moment that some action being essentialized to judgment, character judgment, and it's even being generalized. Some acts that was poorly done has been generalized that like it was totally a bad personality of that person. And these things, exactly as people were saying, exactly it's because of that moral panic probably. But yeah, I just wanted to add that.
There's an idea of the presentation of the self, and we often, at least in the United States, that's the only context I can really speak from, we often still valorize, that single author and think that the work of the author completely reflects who the author is. But then we have examples of like, let's say Joss Whedon and Joss Whedon's work and how it doesn't necessarily reflect him, as we come to learn. So we forget about how complex a lot of these popular culture texts are to produce, and it's not just one person's vision at this point.
And I think I think of this in terms of some national cinemas where and I'm not going to mention it, but where the kind of general idea is that women have to go through the casting couch in order to get roles. And it's not one I write about, so I don't want people to take it the wrong way. But then I think, then if we don't watch the films because of that, aren't we also adding, if they're having to do this and we're cancelling it, then their sacrifice, I think, means nothing, and so I think that we can't think of it just, as you say, in terms of one person, because I think it has wider ramifications. We can lock this in with the Me Too movement, but that has not been very successful in some Asian countries. And indeed in Korea, there was a very popular actor that was outed as part of this, a part of the Me Too in Korea. He ended up, unfortunately, killing himself. And then the Me Too movement kind of went dead, because then the responsibility for the actor's actions were displaced onto the kind of audience or the fans or the consumers and the women who criticised him. And I think that kind of had an effect of cancelling out the kind of voices of the exploited and the underrepresented.
That almost seems to be where the political backlash can come into. It's turning not to the problematic individual and their behaviors, but to those pointing out those problematic behaviors. Christina?
Yeah, just on the topic of Star Wars, also I thought that Gina Carano is kind of an interesting example, also because someone earlier mentioned the disproportionateness that could also kind of be typical for what we perceive as cancel culture, because you would think she wasn't really canceled. She misbehaved on set, like she didn't wear her mask. So of course she was let go. It's like a normal thing you do in the industry. But then people made her into some kind of martyr and were like, we have to counter cancel her and give her her own show. So I thought that was kind of interesting that it kind of turns people into these central figures in a political conflict, where there's also kind of this movement often in terms of cancellation to counter cancel people, and also people who are like, well, now we'll support J.K. Rowling even harder.
Kind of like the
to make
fan,
like a political
anti-fan
statement.
Yeah, yeah. It's where those fan conflicts can come in, and the partisan divide within a fandom can perhaps become even stronger, which maybe then is a good segue to thinking about if a large part of the cancel culture seems to be related to popular culture because we're canceling artists or we're canceling content. But what are the ramifications then of these acts and this way of maybe even looking at things, this perception and interpretation? What are the consequences of that to larger political, economic, social, cultural civilization? What does cancel culture mean really outside of popular culture?
Well, cancel culture, outside of the popular culture, it means that if popular culture cancels, let's say R. Kelly, for example, there are many in the Black community, or Bill Cosby, many in the Black community who still support him by blaming the women or the girls, listening to his music, because listening to his music, some say that why should I stop listening to R. Kelly's music? Because that doesn't, yes, he's a pedophile, a rapist, whatever, he's convicted, but that doesn't mean that his music is not good. And then there are those who say that it was his music that he used to lead these women into race. So cancel culture, depending on the community, outside of pop culture, has different consequences. And sometimes there is political backlash with what Colette said with the Me Too movement.
Something that I was thinking about in relation to this conversation about like the effect on communities is how, as a trans person in the UK, to me, whether someone like absentmindedly just talks about Harry Potter and how much that means to them without a parenthesis about at least an acknowledgement, to me that is like a red flag. To me, that's a way for me to gauge whether I'm safe in a space. Because if you are mindlessly supporting someone who is so vocally and like politically involved, and like J.K. Rowling has not been meaningfully cancelled outside of very specific political social spheres. This is a conversation that I used to realize whether the person I'm talking to has an awareness of this, has an awareness of the impact, even if they don't mean it as an endorsement to TERFs or to transphobia. They might just not be aware, and therefore they're probably also not very well educated on trans issues. So I need to relate to them in a different way. It's a bit of a compass in real life, and like in Sheffield, there is a Harry Potter shop in the mall. So every time I walk by that, I'm like, that's what canceling gets you, like a whole shop dedicated to your franchise. That's, I think, canceling in real life outside of the pop culture conversations is just way less impactful than especially the right-wing media paranoia makes it, which then results in what Christina was saying about de-canceling and like making an active point of platforming these people because they've been cancelled when really nothing happened.
I also sometimes just wanted to add to that. sometimes shocked how little people are aware of the whole J.K. Rowling controversy outside, even people who are like hardcore Harry Potter fans in their own works, who don't seem to be aware of this discussion at all. So sometimes some of my future teacher students say they want to plan a lesson on Harry Potter and want to have their students at school write fan fiction on Harry Potter. And I'm like, do you think that's a good idea? And they're, why not? And they have no idea. The students also have no idea. And so we feel like everyone knows about this, but these discussions still happen in a very specific bubble, so that even people who are self-proclaimed fans sometimes have no idea.
I just wanted to add to what Mars was saying. So we should also think about what we mean by cancel culture again when we are talking about the consequences. So yes, when we are talking about big celebrities like J.K. Rowling, then of course, by canceling them the way that pop culture does, it doesn't really hold them accountable. But if we are thinking about just the action of canceling people, underrepresented minority people are being canceled all the time. It has been before even like the right wing started to use the word like cancel culture and stuff like that. It happened for Ellen, for example. It happened for so many people that have been canceled before. That is actually kind of a double standard that right wing is using to say that, yeah, something is against freedom of speech, but they are actually doing that by anti-trans bill, by other probably ways that they are trying to oppose that.
I was thinking that common denominator about what we're saying is that outside of pop culture, canceling is kind of used a lot of the time as wedge issues to kind of define different camps. Like as Mar said, like how do I relate to these people? And in politics, right wing is like, okay, everyone who thinks that this person should be canceled is a bad person. But we think that this person should be canceled. So we're good people. And this can happen within broader communities and it can happen within smaller communities. So for example, in the Nicolí Wynn case, like, so people will say, I think that she should be canceled. And then they kind of check the water to see what you think. And then this is how I'm going to relate to you. So we kind of take our celebrities as kind of these icons to kind of understand reality and kind of divide reality for the sake of our own identities in a way.
It's interesting because I know when you were saying, I was thinking this as well, and Alon, you helped me with this. There's a theory that we use in communication studies, uncertainty reduction theory or anxiety management theory. And essentially it's, in interpersonal conversations, we're going to be anxious if we don't know someone, and because then we don't know how to act. And it's starting to sound like these types of wedge issues, like who to cancel and why to cancel them, is almost a way for us to start managing that anxiety and that uncertainty to help us to determine how to act towards a person, and even whether or not to act towards a person, whether it's within a fandom or on an interpersonal basis.
I wanted to add to that one small thing that that also kind of sometimes fuels canceling. So when people in our surrounding are starting to behave in a very exclusionary manner towards a specific person, a celebrity, someone on Twitter, we kind of have to, for our sake of our own identity, we have to kind of join in and also be on that side. And it kind of also kind of relates to identity reinforcement, I think.
And Mars?
Yeah, I wanted to say that I think that gradual, like using celebrities or other other people who have been canceled as a way to measure how you interact with a person is just part of like a series of behaviors that at least people who belong to oppressed minorities have been doing, about like having consistently, even more so than just another person, like a more privileged person interacting with another and just having to figure out what's socially appropriate. I think I want to highlight that this is a matter not just of social appropriateness or social anxiety, but of safety. I need to figure out whether I can be open about my identity, tell you my pronouns, or whether I should just brush that off, move on, maybe just not even engage with you. So I think there's something there. And there's also about this idea of like, Nicolí Wynne, I think, is a perfect example of how we conceive who is a celebrity, who is cancelable, because she's a YouTuber. She's not the smallest YouTuber, but she's not A-grade celebrity, right? But the impact, the backlash on some of her opinions and some of her videos have had on her are extremely disproportionate compared to anything she might have done, and have affected her life extremely disproportionately compared to how canceling an A-list celebrity affects theirs. So I do think in these social spaces where it becomes a social signifier to cancel or not cancel someone, then there is this ripple effect where we cancel smaller and smaller people. And Nicolí Wynne is kind of in the middle of that, where you'll have fandoms canceling mutuals on Twitter for liking a ship, which is obviously is going to have a way bigger impact, especially for someone who, like, I don't know, a teenager whose main social interaction is through fandom, being shunned from their online community is very different from The Weeknd being told his TV show kind of sucks. So I think there is also this big divide where I don't think canceling is a useful verb, because we're talking about consequences for someone's action, like in the case of the Me Too movement, and then we're talking about a witch hunt in other cases.
Sure, if anyone wanted to follow up on that, because I was also thinking about how these come about then too. I mean, how do I want to put this? The terms of the consequences as being graduated, essentially, where for some people, the consequences are going to be larger than others. I come out of psychology a little bit, and one of the things that we talked about in psychology, especially clinical psychology, is that oftentimes people will not seek help until they are in some way ostracized from their community. So in some ways, you could possibly see some cases where the attempt to address someone's problematic behavior could be a form of, tough love is what they might call it. But then, in the other cases, you have the moral panic based type, or you have just a simple difference of opinion when it comes to shipping, and that's causing these problems. So maybe my question at this point then is, where do we see these things starting, and does the consequence relate in some way to how it all starts?
We'll be very quiet.
That's a big one, yeah.
I mean, I think it's kind of really difficult. Because I'm quite a lot older than most of you, is that this is a fairly recent thing. So this idea of cancelling is really a modern concept. And I grew up with a whole set of men like Jimmy Savile, but a whole set of them on children's TV, and who kind of later was revealed and served prison sentences. And for me, in terms of that, is that I cannot watch those programs. I can't. And I feel like, and in a way they were, and it's like R. Kelly, people aren't really cancelled. Like celebrities aren't cancelled unless they're visibly cancelled by the law, because otherwise there's a lot of denial that goes on. So like with R. Kelly, I mean, it was years and years of this behaviour. And it was only through the court case that he was visibly cancelled. So I think there's a whole set of cancellations that has to be seen through the law, which is, and therefore, if the law doesn't find someone responsible for those behaviours, so Trump isn't a rapist, but he's an abuser, then people go around saying, oh, well, it's okay that I like him because actually he didn't do this, you know, not really recognising that the two acts are very, very similar. So I think for people who are in power, the consequences are a lot less a lot of the time. I mean, it's like the whole Johnny Depp thing. Who you can cancel and cancel from both of them. And indeed the court case uncancelled Johnny Depp because he had, and I think he was kind of like one of the most high profile people that was cancelled because he has such a huge fandom. And so that kind of was really interesting. And I think that I think perhaps we talk about cancelling when it's not really happening a lot of the time. And I think it's the cancelling, for me, it's cancelling of like free speech in America, you know, cancel culture. You can only read these books, you're only allowed to teach this sort of history. Children aren't allowed to go to drag shows. That to me is the real consequences. What we're seeing in America at the moment, and I'm not thinking we're not going to see it over here, is real life cancel culture, and its real consequences for kind of underrepresented groups. Because I think that those men that have been held to account, and women, there are women, are a lot less than men who behaviour should be held to account. So yeah.
Christina?
When you mentioned the role of the law, that's kind of interesting. It reminded me of something that's going on in Germany at the moment. I don't know if you know the band Rammstein, which is a famous German band, and so the lead singer assaulted several women, apparently. So not before the law yet, so there's still an investigation going on. So I've seen a lot of headlines that are like, should this minor celebrity rename her cat that was called Rammstein? Should you unfriend people that still went to the concert or that still have their tattoos and didn't cover them up yet? And Sarah was just thinking about, because there isn't any legal consequences for him yet, whether people are trying to find some agency and feel like, okay, I can't harm him because he's going to also back to your topic of the consequence for someone who's really high in the power hierarchy, someone who's really low. We can't harm the lead singer, but we can harm the fans, and even though that's completely the wrong place to put your anger, and also doesn't really solve the problem at all and doesn't help anyone. I think it may help people. That's just a thought I had at the moment. Maybe feel some sense of agency, like if the law isn't doing anything, the least I can do is like cancel these people who still seem to be fans.
Yeah, it's kind of like court of public opinion turning into a mob, turning into a lynching. You have, and so if the law is taking too long, whether it's legal routes or legislative routes, public may do their own route. At least that's been in American history since the beginning.
I think also, yes, sorry. I think also we should separate the moment that someone calling out someone and the whole movement of like a cancel culture movement. When someone just calling out someone, they are probably, it was probably their last resort, one of their last resort. Probably they couldn't do anything else, or probably they will yelling out what happened to them because they exactly the justice wasn't happening for them. So they had to probably. And if we see, then the thing that happens is that the culture grasps that, essentializes that, maybe panic, and then decides that what happens to that person, which is exactly opposite of holding someone accountable, or even the person who was in position of less power wanted them to do.
Good point. Princess?
Yes, I was going to say something similar to what Becca said. And it's usually a last resort. And then to piggyback on Colette's point about unless the law does something, there have been a few celebrities who have been cancelled without the law. It's rare, like Stephen Collins, Seven Heavens, America's Perfect Dad, whatever, was cancelled, but the law didn't do anything about it. There was no lawsuit and there was no criminal court. He was just cancelled. His whole career ended in 2014.
Well, and I think even though they didn't have the term, I think back in the past, like Jane Fonda, I don't remember if there were legal consequences for her, but she was definitely canceled for a while and only really came back far more recently. So I think there are definitely instances throughout history where we see this kind of going on, and whether or not they're right or wrong, I think that's a huge question, but we definitely see these instances. We just might not have had the word for it back then.
I think maybe one of the frustrating things about cancel culture, why it kind of really remains in the public eye, is because there's no one-to-one relationship between the offense and the consequences. And I think that our response to canceling is it is related to the offense to some degree, but there's also so much of it, like what's the symbolic meaning of the cancellation? And there's like a negotiation going on about people convincing one another, this is what I think should be the symbolic meaning of cancellation. And that's going to kind of determine down the line what's going to be the consequences. But because there's no like one-to-one match between the offense and the consequence, I think we keep getting angry that the people that we don't think should have been the consequence should have been so severe, and then we see other people who are getting away with stuff. It's kind of like it's always engaging,
which makes me wonder the extent to which we would be having this type of public discourse if the justice system was actually fair and was actually doing what it's structured to do. Mars?
I think when it comes to fairness of the consequences, the power of the person being cancelled is also so important. And like when you said about people being cancelled, pre-cancel culture, my first thought was Winona Ryder, who was called shoplifting and then essentially blacklisted from Hollywood for years, which shoplifting just doesn't seem like in any way comparable to what many people were doing and had been called doing without any consequence. And that's because Winona Ryder was a young woman. And you can find this in any kind of intersection of power where the people who may have done bad things, but also exist at intersections of oppressed groups, have much harsher consequences. And similarly, when we were saying about smaller like Twitter accounts or social media celebrities are canceled in a way harsher ways because people have more access to them and they have less power. And they also can't maybe distance themselves from the online conversation or from the public conversation without meaningfully, for example, losing income. Whereas if someone like J.K. Rowling just stopped tweeting and shut up forever, she would probably keep earning more than many of us could dream of. which is not something someone like a YouTuber can do, because that's their source of income.
Which is kind of how this then, I think, gets wrapped up in the whole freedom of speech issue and the whole censorship issue, which again, in the United States, at least, you're only supposed to be safe from government censorship, which apparently isn't true anymore either. So who knows what's going on in this country. But that idea of, well, you know, J.K. Rowling should be allowed to have her opinions and allowed to speak her piece. But then does that mean she should be free from consequences for her opinions? And I think that's another big struggle point that fans and creators have been dealing with for the past 10 years too, because of social media. What's the difference between platform censorship and just consequences for your beliefs?
I think it's a really difficult one, because I know when I do this with my students, they will start off thinking that we should be cancelling people like R. Kelly. But when they've actually done a piece of research, they actually changed their minds. They think that we shouldn't cancel J.K. Rowling. I think it's very complex. And I mean, the problem is with J.K. Rowling and with Stock is they're not cancelled. I mean, J.K. Rowling's all over my Twitter, And I mean, her opinions get worse as time goes on. So I think that it's very difficult, because J.K. Rowling hasn't done anything that can be that needs the law to intervene, because after all, it's only words. But at the same time, her discourse is very damaging for marginalised people who may well have consequences because of it. And we saw this during the pandemic with the kind of anti-Asian discourse. And we saw that had real consequences, that crimes against Asian Americans went up by over 1,000% in some places in America. So the words do have real consequences. I think this is a problem, and I don't know what you do. You know, you say yes. That's. I think my problem is that these words do have real consequences. This is, you know, because you're denying, in the case of J.K. Rowling, you're denying people's existence, people's right to existence, people's right to inhabit certain spaces. And that has real consequences. So I think, like the discussions we have in fandom, whether we're going to unfollow people because we didn't like what they said, I think it's one thing. But I think in terms of, because I don't know that has these sort of consequences, but in the real world, the consequences of this gender critical discourse, if I put it nicely, it's pretty horrific, you know. And it seems to me it's so contradictory when you think about how popular RuPaul is and the drag shows in all these countries, and families watch it together. So there's a real contradictory, but I do think that consequences are kind of worse for the people who don't have a voice in the discourse, because trans people don't have a voice in this discourse and they're not really listened to. And if they do say something, the whole character is, you know, it's, well, we don't like this person, so we're not going to listen to what they say, even though their kind of their experiences as a result of this are really consequential. So you know, and I think there is work to be done on, like what was done on anti-Asian discourse, how the real impact of this gender critical movement on trans and non-binary people. And I think that work needs to be done, because perhaps if you could show the consequences, because I don't get, do people like J.K. Rowling just not care? Just not care about the people who they are marginalizing?
I think Mars wants to jump in on that.
Yeah.
I just really want to say, like, words like freedom of speech is a complex topic for sure, but like there are countries, and I don't know about America, but there are countries with laws against Nazi apologism, for example. So you can't say those things. In Italy, obviously, because we had like a certain past, we have laws against publicly endorsing a fascist party. As far as I'm aware, in Germany, you can't wear certain symbols or say certain things because of Nazi apologism. And like there is footage of turf like rallies or like protests where they directly quote Hitler. So surely like there is a line there where it stops being just freedom of speech and it starts being active Nazi apologism. There is definitely like calling trans people's existence the new big lie, which is just anti-Semitic rhetoric copy pasted word by word. I think there is like something there where we can't just pretend it's just an opinion.
Well, and that maybe brings me to my last question to help us to wrap up this session is, given that we are all in some way popular culture scholars, what might be a recommendation you would make for what popular culture studies could do in looking at, not necessarily trying to solve, but just looking at, addressing, doing something in relationship to this topic? Is there a way that popular culture studies could intervene? Is there something that they should be looking at more, something that we should be paying more attention to? What do you think is maybe the role of popular culture studies in all of this?
I think starting from language, because that's something we can do, using expressions like cancel culture that refer to this wide umbrella of phenomena in very different ways, kind of supports this right-wing propaganda, where we are pretending cancel culture meaningfully exists as one unified movement or one unified phenomenon, when actually what we've been saying is what gets swept under cancel culture is very different phenomena that should be handled separately. So I think encouraging a conversation where these nuance is acknowledged and these differences are made is very important.
Education. I believe that the popular culture studies need to do more education on what is cancel culture, and to piggyback on what Mars says, to explain the difference between what the right wing is calling cancel culture and the other types of cancel culture.
And I would just
conversation.
Yeah, and to piggyback on that, I would say education both in the classroom and in the public discourse as well.
I mean, what I started doing with my level 5 students is, rather than, I do a module called identity and difference. So rather than tell them what I think, is I actually get them to engage with it themselves. So there's a freedom within the classroom to find their own way. Because what I found in my teaching is it doesn't do anybody any good for me to give my opinion, because then you silence other opinions, and you do need to, you know. So we discussed, should critical race theory be taught or not? What's the difference between sex and gender? So I think you can do those things. I can do that in the MA around censorship as well. I think we have to have this dialogue. And the other thing I want to say, because I'm also a horror specialist, is that we have to recognize the problematic, that texts that we like are problematic, And we have to acknowledge that. We
Mhm.
have to acknowledge that we can like things that are problematic. And I think then that opens the way up for being able to talk about these things rather than shut people down. That, you know, this film, Jeepers Creepers, so De Silva went to jail. He did his time, but he is fully cancelled. But, you know, I mean, one thing is that he's done his time, and surely, you know, or are there certain things that we can't uncancel? But the other thing is that you can say, well, yes, Jeepers Creepers is a good horror film and it's a very effective horror film, but, and I think it's that but that's really important. So Harry Potter is really meaningful to lots and lots of people. And you can say, well, yes, you know, but, and I think that's what we need to be doing. We need to be saying, but.
Mm-hmm. Christina.
I was thinking that one thing I would like to see more is acknowledgement that individuals participate in canceling, but that a lot of the time says something about their environment. That we kind of tend to think both of the people at fault and the people who are doing the canceling just from an individualistic point of view. But this is all a negotiation that happens in our surrounding and kind of channeled through us. And there's a lot of psychological kind of factors involved. And I don't see this kind of like more psychological, more environmental discussion, at least in my surrounding, and like more activist political surrounding. And I think that's part of the reason why it's difficult to have these discussions, because we always put it on the individuals. Either you're with me or you're against me. Instead of kind of understanding that this is a complex dynamic. And I have one circle of friends who's like likes Harry Potter, but doesn't know anything about J.K. Rowling. And another circle that is really like, if you like anything Harry Potter, then I don't want to talk to you. Fortunately for me, I'm not a big Harry Potter fan, but like I would know that if I were, I would have a hard time to kind of be within these two groups.
Yeah.
I also want to add that we can think about one way is exactly talking about making clear distinctions of how the structure of cancel culture is working and how it's impacting people. But also we can go beyond that and think about examples of some cultures that hold accountable people, doing they're holding someone accountable. So public also needs to probably do see the contrast between holding someone accountable and doing the cancel culture.
Yeah, that's an important discussion to have. Christina, any last words?
I was thinking about how it's probably also really helpful for people to know about just that cancel culture can mean so many different things in so many different contexts, depending on who you ask. And I think that's really important when we ask people to take a stance, for example, on a statement, does cancel culture exist or not, that people know that that they have to ask, do you even mean by cancel culture? What does it even mean in this context? Because otherwise they can't really form one's opinion on it.
Which maybe is a good thing to end on, to say anyone who's watching this and listening to this, if you feel that this conversation has been helpful, please do share it with others, people outside of popular culture studies, maybe any teachers that you know as they prepare for the upcoming academic year or are currently teaching. This might be a rather tumultuous year in higher education for a lot of different reasons. And the more prepared we are for these complicated, complex conversations that really require dialogue, I think the better all of us will be to get through this upcoming academic session. So I want to thank you all for coming in today on this last day of June. And I hope wherever you are in the world, that at least it's a nice day for you to be able to get outside for a little bit.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you
Have a
so
good
much.